So no club in the AFL is going to have to make more tough list decisions than the Essendon Bombers. That is because we have more players on our list than any other team when you count the inactive list with the 4 injured players who are out for the season. But this video is going to be focusing specifically on their replacements, the mid-season draftees, and what their prospects are of staying on the list, whether they could, should, or in the case will stay on the list. I'm going to discuss the 4 of them and their prospects in this video. So the first and most likely player to remain on the list is Archer May. So why is he the most likely to remain on the list? Well, the reason is he's signed, for starters, an 18-month contract. The other 3 have all signed 6-month contracts. So the 18-month contract obviously takes him through to 2026. Now you might ask, well, why wouldn't everyone sign an 18-month contract? Well, I guess the argument is that if you sign a 6-month contract and you back yourself and you're able to back your own ability and you believe that you're good enough to remain on the list, then you can negotiate a better deal for yourself at the end of this year. And obviously Archer May can't do that because he's signed an 18-month contract. But I think even had he signed a 6-month contract, he would probably remain on the list anyway. He is 20 years old. He turns 21 in August. He's 198 centimetres. And of all the 4 players, I think he's the one that has the most upside. He's a physical brute. If you look at his physique, he's a huge young man. He's probably still got a little bit of growth in him, although turning 21 in August, he's probably going to stop growing soon. He's 198 centimetres. I see him as a big potential key marking forward, and I think he is. If I was the Essendon coaching staff, I would look at Archer May as a potential duo alongside Nate Caddy for the decade ahead. So I think he is almost certain to remain on the list. There are going to be some very, very tough decisions to make, not just with the mid-season draftees, but with all the players. Look, I'm going to make probably some other videos just going through some of the other players, but I just wanted to focus on these 4 for starters. May is big, tall, from what all we hear, dedicated, and I see him as a potential pillar in the forward line, especially when 2 metre Peter, who turns 29 in 2 months' time, when he eventually, his tenure at Essendon eventually ends, I see Archer May as an important part of our future. Blackeston, Lachie Blackiston. So this one will be touch and go. He turns 27 years old on the 9th of September. He's 203 centimetres. One thing he can offer us is dual position status. He can play in the ruck and he can play in the back line. He's obviously played in the back line this year, and I think he's got progressively better each game. But there's obviously no real improvement in him at his age. He's at the age now where whatever he is, that's what he is. All right. Now he probably wasn't expecting to be turned into a backman when he was playing in the WAFL, and that's something that he can add a string to his bow. But the reality is, of course, that we will be getting back Reid and Mackay next year, barring injury. Touch wood. Let's just make an assumption that they're playing. Obviously, injuries still do happen, and we just don't know how Reid is going to hold up. But at the end of the day, we still have got Reid and Mackay down there, and that is going to make it more difficult for Blackeston. I mean, one positive for him is that Jaden Laverty, who is coming out of contract, will probably be delisted, I would imagine, because he's in his late 20s, and he probably wouldn't be in a team at the moment. And if you're looking for the future, then he probably doesn't, Laverty doesn't get, offered a new deal, and he will most likely go, which opens up another spot for Blackeston. But I would say Blackeston's spot on the list is probably less likely than likely at the moment. I think he's probably a 30 to 40% chance of staying on the list. Like anyone, you don't want anyone delisted. Like we all want what's best for these players, but the reality is that when you're trying to cut the list from 47 down to 38 or so, and you've got a 27-year-old kind of journeyman player who's playing in a position where other injured players are going to be coming back onto the team next year, it does beg the question whether he's able to hold his spot. Now, could we envisage him as a depth player who's able to step in when a player gets injured, like what he's doing now? Well, yes, he could do that, but the reality is, could you afford to use a list spot up for that with a player in his age bracket? at this stage, there's a lot that needs to develop with the draft and how many picks we've got and all those sort of things and who gets traded and all that sort of thing. But at this stage, I would probably put him as maybe a 30 to 40% chance of staying on the list. I think he's probably more likely to be delisted than not. Now, I might be totally wrong on this. This is just my call looking at the list spots available, and tough decisions need to be made. But I'd like to know what you guys think. I might be totally wrong. Well, there is no right and wrong at the moment. It's all just a prediction. But I'd like to know what you guys think and whether you think he should remain on the list next year. Liam McMahon. So Liam McMahon, I don't think is certain to remain on the list, but I think he's more likely than Blackeston. I would put McMahon as about an 80% chance. He is 23 years old. He turns 24 in May next year. He's 197 centimetres. And, I've gone through quite a lot the attributes that he has. But what I like about him in particular is that he, along with May and Caddy, as a forward trio looking for the future, and I'm just taking Peter Wright out of it at the moment because Peter Wright, turning 29 next year, well, regardless of whether Wright's on the list next year, probably won't be on the list in a couple of years. So I look at McMahon, Wright and May as three forwards that all offer something a little bit different. I see Caddy a bit like the Jeremy Cameron, the athletic type who has got free rein to sort of do what he wants in the 50, maybe roam a bit further up the ground, do the spectacular thing. I look at May as the big sort of brute marking forward with the huge physique who can take contested marks and is a big physical presence. And I see McMahon as that traditional full forward, the mark and lead with the accurate kick. So I see him as definitely a player that should stay because he is a little bit different to every other player we have. There aren't really any other players that we have that are kind of a tall mark and lead full forward that's not necessarily that athletic, but apart from that deficiency, he's pretty good at the other areas of the game. So, look, he's an accurate kick. He understands where the ball is, and he just always finds his way to kick goals. He's kicked more than two or more goals in every game he's played at VFL or AFL level for the last 2 years. So he's never kicked 0 or 1. He's kicked 2 or more for 2 years in a row. So he's the kind of player that knows where the ball is. So I think he's probably about an 80% chance of staying on the list. And I think he is a important part of our future. Look, with list spots so tight, it's not certain. But I would think he is more likely than not to remain on the list. And I would say he is the second most likely player behind May to remain on the list. The last player, Oskar Smartt. He is 19 years old. He turns 20 in October. Had 3 behinds on the weekend. Looks a pretty dedicated player in terms of his tackling. I think he's probably more likely to remain on the list than not because I think that the club would probably see him as a better option than Menzies, given that he is 4 years younger than Menzies and probably has more upside. Menzies, I guess, I feel a bit sorry for Menzies because Menzies is not really doing anything wrong at VFL level. He was one of our best the other week and he's had a couple of good games. But do you go with the 23, soon to be 24-year-old Menzies, or do you go with the 19-year-old Oskar Smartt, potentially with a bit more upside? So, look, it's a tough decision, and it doesn't just rely on what they do with Menzies. There's other players coming out of contract. There's Hobbs and Pryor, Shield, Lual, Davey and others. I mean, I can go on. I'm not going to go into that too much in detail now because I'm just focusing on the 4 mid-season draftees. But, you've got to remember, Smartt was playing in the VFL only a few weeks ago, so he is no certainty to remain on the list. I put him as 60-40 to remain on the list. I see him as probably the third most likely to remain on the list. Blackeston to me would be the least likely. And like I said, I could be totally wrong on this. This is just how I'm reading it right now as I'm looking at the list and looking at how the players have performed. I just think his age bracket benefits him a little bit and just gives him that edge over Menzies. Now remember, if Menzies goes as expected, you might think, well, that makes it more certain that Smartt stays on the list. But we have got a player, an academy player coming into the club next year, Hussein Al-Achkar, who's been going gangbusters in the Coates Talent League, the under-18s competition, having many, many shots at goal, and he will be joining us next year. And he's a small forward. And he's expected to be, a reasonably high draft pick, maybe somewhere in the high teens, maybe in the 20s, something like that. So you've got to take that into account as well, that they'll be competing for each other for that spot. So the fact that Hussein Al-Achkar will be coming into the team next year makes it more difficult to justify Smart's position as well. I mean, obviously you can have him as a depth player, which is certainly possible, but list spots are tight, and Hussein's ascension to the list next year is another variable or another spanner in the works as to whether Smartt remains on the list or not. Now, having said all this, there are so many variables to consider. I mean, currently we have 4 picks in the draft, but that could end up being more if we trade players. There are, of course, players who are contracted, for 2026 and beyond. You got your Langfords and Parishes and Perkins and all those sort of things. Their contract doesn't end this year. Their contract ends in other years after this. So they're more likely to stay on the list, but they could get traded. And that opens up more draft picks. And then, sometimes clubs have draft picks and they pass on late draft picks and then they get traded for future picks. There's all sorts of variables to consider, and it's impossible to know for certain. But I see Smartt as probably a 60-40. So I've got May is probably certain to remain on the list. I've got McMahon about an 80% chance. I've got Smartt at 60-40. And I've got Blackeston probably just the least likely, just based on his age profile and the fact that other players will be returning on his position. Maybe that's a bit unfair. Maybe I've read it wrong. But look, I want you guys to contribute and let me know what you guys think, because you might have a different point of view. And you might have looked at these players a bit differently, and you might know a bit more than me if you've been watching them really closely. So I'd like to get your views on that. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel. I hope you have a great day. And as always, go Bombers!